So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Before we start, I want to say a quick thank you to all of you who've tuned in today. It means so much to me that you have made us part of your day. I know how busy you all are, and I know what you're doing because I'm doing it too. All of my patients are doing it, my friends and family. We got kids to run around. But thank you for making us part of your day. If you like what you hear, I hope you do, I ask that you pass it on to family and friends. We're building an audience. And by the way, we are building an audience. I'm very, very happy about that. And why am I happy? I'm happy because the people that I bring to this show on a weekly basis are truly amazing people. And today we have an exceptionally amazing individual on the show. His name is Dr. Milhoan. He is, I told him beforehand that this may take a long time to get through it, but I'll do my best. He is a pediatric cardiologist. He is also the pastor, the head pastor of Calvary Chapel Church in South Maui, Hawaii. He also has a PhD in cardiovascular pharmacology and physiology. He's an Air Force veteran of 13 years, been to Iraq during that time. He's done a lot of amazing things. He's been to Mongolia multiple times. We'll talk about that. But before we get into all of that, I just want to welcome Dr. Kirk Milhoan to the Hamilton Review.
Thanks so much, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Such a pleasure to see you. And I know you're at work between patients right now, so we're gonna get right to the point. But before we talk about all of the things that you're doing, I want to talk about you. I want you to talk about you. So if you would be kind enough to kind of back up in your life, kind of go back to where you grew up and the different inflection points that caused you to be who you are today. Particularly, you went into pediatric cardiology, and finally you became a pastor in Maui. So, Dr. Kirk, the microphone belongs to you.
Thanks, Bob. So I was born in Pastoral, California, and my dad worked in the diving industry, and eventually did commercial diving. I lived in Paso Robles and Morro Bay and Cayucas and Carpinteria, and we ended up traveling quite a bit. My parents were never of resources. My dad and my mom both got associate's degree from Santa Barbara City College, but I was always a curious boy, and they used to have these how and why books, and I would eat those up. I always had lots of questions. And my dad had an accident working on an underwater laboratory in Puerto Rico, and it ended up that we sat in the hospital for quite some time. And that was probably the genesis of my desiring to be a doctor. I would look at the doors that said no admittance, and I would wait staring at those doors, waiting to see when my mom would come. My brothers and I would stand in front of the elevators trying to figure out which floor my dad was on. And then we would go from elevator to elevator, and we would do this for hours as we waited. My mom didn't have any help, and my dad needed quite a bit of help in the hospital room. And I used to think, what in the world is behind those doors that is so important that I can't get in? And it just sort of really spawned my curiosity. So as an 8-year-old, this is what I would say. I was really quite obnoxious as an 8-year-old, probably not too much different than I am now. But I remember my dad said, well, what kind of doctor you want to be? I said, I want to be a neurosurgeon, so nobody can ever complain about my mistakes. I don't even know where that came from, but that was sort of the obnoxious little kid I was. I maintained that curiosity and never really lost the idea of becoming a doctor. So we eventually, from Puerto Rico to Florida, we moved back to California. I grew up in Morro Bay. Ended up going to Point Loma Nazarene College, planning on being a medical doctor. But I sort of switched from neurosurgery. I wanted to be I wanted to be one of the doctors for astronauts. I wanted to be one of the NASA flight surgeons. But I really didn't. I was pretty lazy as a student. I didn't once I felt like I knew the information well enough, I sort of ceased studying. And one of my good friends in college one time said, he goes, Kirk, you've got all the good questions, but I have the answers. And that was true on tests. So once I felt like I was as smart as everybody else in the room, then I didn't feel like I needed to study. And I wasn't sure I really wanted to study for the MCAT, the test we take before we go to medical school.
Sure. Yeah.
And some guys from UCSD came in, were talking about all the different research programs, trying to get us excited in the PhD program there. And one of the research areas was a respiratory physiology platform on the shuttle. And I was like, wow, maybe this is the way I could get into Air Force or astronaut medicine. Now, I was so proud as a young kid that I rarely asked questions of how I should get something done. As I look back, it would have been a lot better if I would have gained wisdom from other people. But I just sort of charged ahead thinking I knew everything as a 21-year-old. So I got into UCSD. I went there to get my PhD. As I was finishing up my time at Point Loma Nazarene College, I realized that, or the Challenger blew up. So the Challenger exploded. And so that stopped all aeronautical and space research at that time. So here I am going to a PhD. And so I sort of moved into large animal studies. And I was looking specifically, I wanted to do something that wasn't just petri dishes and pipettes. And so I got involved with a lab that was studying how, if exercise improved people's hearts after they had a heart attack. And we had a pig model. And so I started doing pig surgery, heart surgery then. And they asked me if I could grow cells to sort of make a cellular model of a heart attack and see why that was all about. So that was what my PhD was about, but I always wanted to be a doctor. And so I had become a Christian when I was 15 and a half, and through campus life, Youth for Christ. And so that's what eventually led me down to Point Loma Nazarene to get my degrees in. And so when I was at UCSD, some friends of mine were doing medical mission in Tijuana. And I went down there with them. And I had always talked about, I love kids. I've always loved to be around kids. As I grew older, I still loved kids. And I had that sort of foolish idea that, if you love kids, you can't be a pediatrician because you love kids too much, which I always remind people. I said, do you think that you love children more than we love children? But
Kirk, not to interrupt you, but I'm not really totally sure I understand that philosophy, because most people who don't like kids don't become pediatricians. I'll tell you, because you swim among children all day long, and you're listening to them complain and crying and screaming. So you better have some kind of enjoyment of children and see beyond that. That's for sure. But anyway, I'll let you continue.
So when I was in Tijuana, I realized with these residents that I was going down with, I thought, wow, I actually really liked seeing the kids more than I liked seeing the adults. I enjoyed interacting with them more. And I'm very glad that God gives everybody different desires and things that they are interested in. And so I thought, well, you know what? I think I'm going to be a pediatrician, and I'm doing a PhD in cardiology, so I should be a pediatric cardiologist. So when I got out of when I finished my PhD, I needed to take a year off, and so I could get in. And so I eventually went to medical school, and the Air Force helped pay for my medical school. But when I was down in Tijuana that day, I remember I wrote myself a note. I said, Kirk, never forget about the girl with the shoes. And years later, I found it, and I had forgotten about the girl with the shoes until I saw that note. And I realized that, in San Diego, we're about 17 miles from the border. And I was seeing this little 8-year-old girl, and she had two different shoes on because that's what she had.
Yeah.
But they were two different shoes. And I thought, wow, what an amazing thing is that 17 miles has such a difference on whether you have the same shoes or not. And I grew up in a trailer. I was trailer trash. So it wasn't like I came from means, but I thought, wow, we were poor, but we were never that poor that I had two different shoes. And that was probably also where I really started thinking about, I'd like to be a part of helping those people who, for no choice of their own, especially as children, they had no choice I had no choice where I was born. So I just felt probably purely led by the Holy Spirit that was something I was going to do. And so the Air Force paid for my medical school because I had no idea how I was going to pay for it. And I'm very thankful for that. The Air Force also decides where you go to residency, whether you get a civilian residency or you do your Air Force in the, if you do your Air Force in the armed services. They chose me to go out to California at Travis Air Force Base up by Sacramento, which is wonderful because that's where I met the lovely Dr. Milhoan. She was a third-year medical student when I was an intern, and I worked one night in the peds inpatient during the winter when we got no sleep and everybody was sick. And I talked to her friend all night, and she eventually set us up. And Kim and I were married less than a year later. So I finished my pediatrics, and the Air Force allowed me to go to pediatric cardiology. And during that time, I went back down to UCSD and was doing my Pediatric Cardiology Fellowship. And I started doing this work at an orphanage down in Mexico that was right outside of Ensenada. My wife and I would go down once a month to take care of 20 kids who were devastated by encephalopathies and birth injuries and such. And that wasn't necessarily the population I liked to work with. Every person has their population. I like to work with kids that had a heart defect, and we could fix a heart defect, and then you go about your business. And there's something wrong, you make it right.
You fix it. Yeah.
And fix it. People who work with kids with chronic illnesses, it's a whole different mindset and a whole different personality and a beautiful patience about that. And what I realized after 3 years of going down there once a month to treat constipation, make sure they were feeding well, adjust seizure medications, doing all these non-pediatric cardiology things, I realized I fell in love with these kids. Not necessarily what they had, but I just fell in love with them. And that softened quite a bit of my hard heart and stuff. But while we were down there, people heard that I was in pediatric cardiology training, and they found this girl who was she was a daughter of a migrant farm worker in Mexico. So, if you're a migrant farm worker in Mexico, you're definitely on the lower end of the right. Socioeconomic status. And when she was born, her father was told that she had a heart murmur, and if it wasn't fixed, she would be dead by age 10. Someone who was part of a clown ministry for a church, who knew somebody who talked to her, that talked to the father, eventually it came back to me, and I brought down one of the first portable echo machines we had and did an echo and realized it wasn't that big of a deal. It was pretty severe. It was very severe, but it wasn't a big deal to fix. And so we got her up. UCSD agreed to let us do it gratis. Everybody volunteered their time. Nobody charged anything. And we took this kid up, took her to the cath lab, and she had never been in an elevator. She thought, oh my God, I got this room. The room is moving, But she had a severe pulmonary stenosis, so she didn't have enough blood going out to her lungs. So she couldn't run. She couldn't play. She was 9, and her dad had been praying for her every day since she was born. That someone would come, because he had no money. He couldn't get anything done. And so I show up, and we get her all to the point. We take her to the cath lab, and when I was helping hold the catheters, the balloon went up, and I could feel the valve crack when it opened up. And great results. She recovered she got to go home a couple days later. We put her on some medicine for a couple of months. I saw her in follow-up, and she looked great. And the father was overwhelmed that his prayers for 9.5 years were answered. And it felt like she was 6 months away from dying, because that's what he'd been told if she's not prepared. And I was like, wow, God, that's pretty cool. I like to do those kinds of things. I'd like to do some more of them. And so Samaritan's Purse has the Children's Heart Project. I went and talked to them and I said, hey, I'm a cardiology fellow. Is there any place I can help? They said, well, how do you feel about Mongolia? And I go, well, I'd have to go back and look on a map and see exactly where it is. I don't have any feelings about Mongolia. And they go, well, we have a doctor over there who's never used an echocardiogram machine and we need to teach her and we're going to drop one. We're going to send one over. Are you willing to go over and teach her? So that started my time in Mongolia. That was in December of 2000. And I saw so many kids that needed help, so many kids. And we could only bring so many over the US to get repaired. Then I also ended up over in Africa at Tenwick Hospital in Kenya. And I went there to do basically pediatrics. And this was my sort of going into my last year of fellowship. And I had asked God, could you send me more of these kids like Ellie Follett from Mexico? I'd like to do more of those. And so I ended up in the inpatient unit and sending kids home to die. Mm-hmm. Because they had such bad rheumatic disease. As you know, this is just things that could be easily treated if you could treat strep throat. But they don't get that. So they don't even just have the access. And so I was sending these 11, 12-year-old children home to die. And on July 4th of 2001, I remember walking down to celebrate, all the expats were going to celebrate Independence Day. And as I walked down, I just started to sob. And I said, God, if I ask you to help more of these kids, you've got to show me how I can do it. Because right now I see a whole lot of need and not any way to get this done. Well, as he does, he hears those prayers, and a lot of times he answers them lots of different ways over lots of different time frames. And so I kept going back to Mongolia, and after about a couple of years of going to Mongolia, I said, I've got to go start finding these kids and getting them treated earlier, because I was finding all these kids too late. You know, the big holes in the heart between the pumping chambers, the heart called a VSD. If we don't get those repaired by 2 years of age, they're usually inoperable. And then they'll live maybe to their 30s, but they die a pretty young death, and they're usually blue and tired when they die.
Yeah.
And I got tired of telling mother after mother that we were too late. And it's not, you know this, it is brutal to tell a mother bad news about her child.
Yes.
The cries of a wailing mother are something that once you've heard them, you hope to never hear them again. Mm-hmm. So I started organizing. I talked to the head of the children's hospital in Mongolia, and I said, I'd like to start bringing teams and start screening the country. And I started that in 2003. And so I just brought teams. And in 2004, I had a whole bunch of people who wanted to come, including a cardiac surgeon, John Kupferschmidt. And he said, Kirk, there are way too many kids over here for us to bring them all to the US. We got to start teaching them how to do it in Mongolia. So we started that process. My wife, the lovely Dr. Milone, who's a pediatric cardiac anesthesiologist, was our anesthesiologist. That was her first real gig out of fellowship. And it was a miracle to get it done. We had to put together all these things, but we were able to do the first pediatric heart-lung bypass case in Mongolia. Wow. They were using ether anesthesia with ice. So it was like throwing a child into a frozen pond, waiting for them to die, and then pulling them out, operating on their heart really quickly, and then hoping they survive. Wow. So we started that, and I continued to screen around the country. So it took me, I've been to Mongolia 48 times. It took me a number of trips to go to the 28 different district hospitals and do that. And so that started happening. And so things just led from there.
So hold on for 1 second. So you got involved with Mongolia as a result of Samaritan's Purse said that they're going to drop an ultrasound, and you started. Then one thing happened. One thing led to the next, and you basically were catching all these kids too late, and they get, I guess, Eisenmenger syndrome. Is that what you're? That's yeah. And which is basically an irreversible, I guess, end result of not being corrected. So you were seeing this, and then You went, okay, 48 times to Mongolia. That's a long time. You can't. I mean, 48 times in Mongolia. That's huge. So were you actually in practice at this point, Dr. Milhoan, or what?
I did. I started this in 2000 when I was still a fellow, and then I entered the Air. I went active duty in the Air Force
Yeah.
in 2002. And so I was in the Air Force from 2002 and 2009, and that's when we did the bulk of the heart surgery and then my trips to Mongolia.
So the Air Force was okay with you going. You must have had enough time off to get over there and do your screening, because that is.
Yeah, I could do some humanitarian trips, and then I took my leave to go, and I would go sometimes over there to help bring kids back to the U.S. to get surgery. And then while I was there, I would screen more kids. So I did all those kinds of things. Yeah, while I was in the active duty Air Force.
Wow.
In between, and I was organizing surgical trips while I was deployed in Iraq. So
amazing. So you actually were deployed during the Iraqi war? Is that correct?
Twice.
Twice during the war, and I know that we're going to get to this in a second, but so you were able to screen all of Mongolia. You found hundreds and hundreds of cases. Is that correct? And this, you were able to recruit a doctor, cardiac surgeon, to actually go over there and teach. So you have accomplished that. Do they now have cardiac pediatric surgery over in Mongolia?
Yeah, and they have adult cardiac surgery with bypass case instead of using the ether and the thing. And then the Luxembourg Foundation and the USAID built them 5 ORs and a complete ICU because of we made a proof of concept. Wow. And so, yeah, so I haven't gone over there for a number of years because now there are 7 pediatric cardiologists over there, and they don't need me anymore.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'll tell you what. Just to take a second here, listeners, everyone listening. This This is amazing, and this is a Herculean effort on behalf of Dr. Milhoan. You have made a difference, Kirk, in the world. You have made a gigantic difference, and not necessarily your own hands per se, but because you were able to recruit and delegate and bring in those like-minded people who saw the vision of that little girl in Mexico. So God bless you for what you've done. This is truly amazing. So friends, you're listening to a world changer here, but he's not done. Keep going. So you went to Iraq twice in the Air Force. You left the Air Force in 2009. Is that the correct date?
Yeah. Well, I was in one of my times in Iraq. I got someone asked if there were any pediatric cardiologists in Iraq. And I responded and I said, yeah. And he goes, we have a whole bunch of kids, Iraqi kids, that need to be seen. And so I had met someone during my M16 train who ended up being the doctor to the Surgeon General of Iraq. And so I called her and I said, hey, I'd like to see all these kids. Can you set up something for me to see all the blue kids from Iraq? And so I went down to the National Iraqi Assistance Center in the Green Zone. I brought my echo machine and I screened about 60 kids in 2 days. All of them were blue. It was like the Smurf village that showed up. And these kids were as blue as could be. Their stats are between 40 and 60.
Wow.
And so we got almost all those kids out to get repaired in New Jersey through Gift of Life. And then in 2009, I had done some other stuff. I started going over to Kosovo. I went to Sudan a couple of times. I went to Yemen a couple of times. Started doing a lot more work in Kosovo. And then once I got out of the military in 2009, I basically went full time as a medical missionary. So then I traveled. I would travel, probably do 13 trips a year.
Amazing. And this was funded. How were you funded? Because you have a wife.
And we just paid for it. We lived simply, and we paid for it.
Yeah. And were you also working at the same time? So you
not for a number of years, probably for about 2 or 3 years. I was just doing humanitarian work.
Wow, amazing. And so 13 trips a year you were making. You went to Kosovo. Remind everyone what was going on in Kosovo at that
Yeah,
at that time.
so I went to Kosovo in 2001, right as the war had ended. So I went there 15 or 20 times. We've done heart surgeries and cardiac catheterizations and pacemaker implantations there. Yeah, I'm just the guy who finds the problems. I'm completely dependent upon an entire team, from the anesthesiologist to the surgeon to the interventional cardiologist, to the post-op nurses to the ICU doctors who come along, the pharmacists, everyone else who comes along. So when we went to Mongolia, we would typically bring 35 people because we'd staff the ICU all night, so 24 hours a day. So yeah, I'm just the guy who is motivated because I'm the one who sits in front of the crying mother.
Yeah.
And because of the girl with the shoes. None of these families, especially the ones who got caught in war, none of these families, it wasn't their choice. I have nothing but God's grace to say where I was born that gave me the abilities. I grew up in a country that I had abilities. I had the opportunity to use some God-given abilities. You don't have to be the smartest guy in the world to be a doctor. You just have to be willing to work hard and memorize an enormous amount of facts. That's all it is. You know that, right? We're not the smartest people. We're just
hold on, Kirk. You're blowing my cover here. You're
well, Bob's the smartest guy.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what, Dr. Milhoan is correct. You don't have to be the smartest guy. You can ask anybody I went to junior high and high school with. That I'm not. But anyway, you do have to be a little bit disciplined to memorize all that stuff. Right? The brachial plexus and all the other nerves that you got to remember and things that. Anyway. Well, there's something you have. Listen, Dr. Pastor Milhoan, you do have some kind of leadership ability, because to put all that stuff together requires another skill. And I don't want to go into it in great detail, but I am curious. How do you find other people to help you? Because a lot of people say, "Oh, that's too bad. That person has X, Y, Z. I wish I could help them." But you take that to a different level, and you figure out, you find resources to get the job done. How do you do that?
So part of it is the pediatric heart community. A lot of us are really moved by wanting to be able to use our skill set for God's glory, to be able to show people who maybe feel they have been forgotten that God heard the prayers of their mother or their father or their grandparents. And to be a part of that is very exciting, because a lot of times those of us who are subspecialized do missions and we enjoy it, but we wish we could use the skill set that we have. And so when I open that up to people, usually it starts out small, right? I didn't start this thinking I was going to do this. I just started because there was a need.
Yeah.
And then it just grows. And people are like, wait, oh, we get to do this. We get to be a part of this. Oh, I've been wanting to do something like this my whole life, and I didn't think I would ever be able to use these skills on a medical mission. So part of it's just telling the story, telling the Ali Follett story. It still touches my heart. It's hard not to cry when I tell it.
Yeah, no, I see you're welling up in tears, and please don't do that, because you'll make me cry too, Pastor Kirk.
But I think anyone who understands what it takes to do really high level medicine realize what a blessing it is that we have in the U.S. that every children who needs heart surgery gets heart surgery in the U.S.
Sure.
They do. So, and that's very fortunate, because I go to a whole bunch of countries where that's not true at all. In fact, they just have, in a large sense, have given up. What's made it harder on the poor countries is information is now coming in what could be. And you can imagine that actually increases frustration and anxiety for families, because now it's like, well, what can I do? I don't have any money. So that's another joy that's infectious, is when we get to go and people said, why would anybody come to this place? I have kids in the U.S. right now getting heart surgery. I found in Papua New Guinea, and it was too complicated for us to do there. We started doing missions in Papua New Guinea, and there's a group out of Australia that does them, but we have to do them simply until we build up the infrastructure. But we just sent over 2 kids from Papua New Guinea, and the parents were just like, everyone's doing this for us for free. But to me, that is, my sins have been forgiven by a free gift of Jesus Christ, and the Bible tells me to act like him and to give things away and to be generous. And so if I sit on a plane a lot so I can go help people who have broken hearts, who need a free gift so they can live, I'm willing to do that, not only because it's what Jesus has asked me to do, but it's also, it feels very, very right.
Yeah. No,
when I get to go, and it's pure medicine, right? It's pure medicine. So there's so many things that if you're getting paid for it or this, it's okay, right? Everyone needs to be able to pay the bills and stuff like that. But boy, when you can do something for free for someone who can't pay you back, there's a purity to that is a true joy. And when we don't have to do all the electronic medical record and we can just do pure medicine and we can look, we're not worried about if our chart's done. What we're worried about is that patient and that child in front of us and what we can do. So it's not very hard to recruit people once they get a taste of it.
You know what, Kirk? You know that I do medical missions as well.
Yes.
I just finished my 50th trip recently to Jamaica. And in addition to having that great sense of feeling very, 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 very joyful and very, very happy about that, it's really fun. It's fun.
Mm-hmm.
When we do medical mission trips, people talk to me about this all the time. They go, well, you go in here and go in there. But you know what? We have a gigantic, wonderful, fun time. And I've met some of the people who've joined me on these teams. I've had some of the most joyous moments in my life out in the middle of nowhere, in the far reaches of Africa or wherever it may be. And we've gone a lot of places. But you're absolutely right. There is such a feeling of fulfillment and a goodness and blessing, and you can't deny that. It's really wonderful.
You with these people who go with you or with the families you're with, you cry with them, you laugh with them. Because of what we do, we get a lot of, rather than getting to go to the standard tourist restaurant or this, we get brought into people's homes and they feed us. Yeah. And we get real home meals.
Yeah.
And whether that's grasshoppers or fermented mare's milk or fermented camel's milk in Mongolia or fresh, warm sheep's yogurt,
Yeah. I actually avoid the countries that eat grasshoppers, so I haven't had those yet. You have to tell me the list of those countries so I can avoid them. But no, you're right. I always tell people that this is, when we go on these trips, it is not like you're in this big bus riding through the countryside looking at the people from afar. You are up close and personal, right in their lives, and I think that that's the part of the joy of medical missions. And you have, I would just want everyone to know that Dr. Milhoan has surpassed my efforts, logarithmically times 10, because what you've done is really, truly astounding. You are now, I want to go back for 1 second, because you went to Iraq. How many times did you go to Iraq after the war?
I was deployed twice.
Deployed twice, but you went back multiple other times too.
Yeah, I've been to Iraq, Arab and Kurdish Iraq, over 40 times.
40 times. This is just huge in terms of the number of times, because it takes a long time to get to Iraq. It probably, how do you get to Iraq, by the way? How do you fly there?
Easiest way is either through Turkey or through Qatar. That's the easiest way.
Okay, all right. I think they still have a war going on over there, so we haven't been to Iraq yet. But anyway, your accomplishments are truly, truly remarkable. Now you're working in Tanzania, and you're teaching the doctors there kind of what you did in Mongolia. That's right?
Yeah. So they have a population of 60 million. It's very young, so that's 1/5 of our population. But we don't have a young population. We have an old population. We don't have a very high birth rate, so we don't have a lot of kids being born. Tanzania is a young population. They have lots of kids being born. So
Yeah.
60 million. For us, we have, let's say, probably 100 pediatric heart centers in our country. So let's say average to a state. In Tanzania, they have one.
Wow. Amazing.
One.
Yeah.
They should have at least 20.
Mm.
So the backlogs that they have are remarkable. So we're trying to open the second pediatric heart center, or we've opened it, but we're trying to get it fully staffed and fully up and running. But it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, no, and I know you're doing that groundwork right
and
now.
Those are long trips.
So I want to change the topic here a little bit, because you're a pastor. You're now a pastor, and I've heard Dr. Milhoan minister, and he's compelling and powerful and great messages. But you're the pastor of Calvary Chapel there in South Maui. This is a new phase of your life. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So my wife and I were wondering what God was going to do with us, and so we were asking. We felt like God. Well, we thought we would probably go start a heart hospital in Africa or the Middle East. We both, at one point, I was the chief of pediatric cardiology at the Children's Hospital in San Antonio. She was the chief of pediatric cardiac anesthesia at the Children's Hospital. So maybe that was something God wanted us to do there, but I'm not really good at administration. So that's not my skill set. But then maybe we thought maybe I could just keep doing purely humanitarian work. And so I remember one time, about 12 years ago or 11 years ago, I was on my knees in a hotel. I spent a lot of time in airports and hotels in Johannesburg. And I said, God, what would you like me to do? Would you like us to do this? Would you like us to do this? Or would you like us to do this? I gave him 3 choices. I figured I had covered all the bases that I could see. About 6 months later, I got offered the opportunity to be part of the people that a church was, Calvary Chapel South Maui, was going to select a new pastor. That wasn't one of my choices that I had given God. But as they brought it up, I started thinking about it more and more again. And I just asked God if this is what you would like me to do. And I didn't hear it audibly, but I heard it somewhere in my body that the answer was yes. And so that was a little over 10 years ago that we started the Pediatric Cardiologist Becomes a Pastor experiment, that everyone was wondering if that was going to succeed. And often I was wondering. I remember one time I was doing something that was pretty mundane. It wasn't when I was preaching or anything like that. It was mundane. Most of the work of a pastor is mundane. But people need mundane help. They need to drive somewhere. They need someone to help them. It isn't. And I was driving and I was thinking, God, I could be in the operating room helping do a transesophageal echocardiogram on a neonate with transposition of the great arteries. But here I am helping someone move. And this, I heard him a little bit louder. He said, "Oh, do you think you're too good for that?" And then the next time, I learned my lesson from that. I was very humbled when God said that. And the next time I remember, I got called and said, Pastor Kirk, we can get all the recyclables out of the swim meet. All we have to do is, after it's over at 9:00 at night, we can go and grab all the trash and sort out the bottles and aluminum cans, and we can make all that money. We can give it to missions. And I thought, the last thing I want to do at 9:30 at night is to go down and pull through trash and to get this. But how can I refuse someone when he's offered me all this money for missions? And so here I find myself, these other 2 nice people, and people put nasty stuff in water bottles, by the way. And so as I was doing this, and then the next day I had to because we used our van for the food pantry from the church, so I had to take all the trash bags full of the recyclables out of the van so the van could be used to go get the food for the food pantry. Then I had to put them all the way back in so I could take them to recycling. As I'm sitting there recycling, there are these 4 wonderful Hawaiian ladies who are helping me, and they have a great attitude while it's hot and we're separating all these different containers and we had to get the water out of them or whatever they put in there. And I didn't have such a good attitude because I was thinking, I could be in an operating room. But then before I said anything stupid or thought anything stupid, I remembered this. This is pretty bad, but it's not as bad as washing disciples' feet.
Yeah.
And so who is my example? My example is Jesus Christ. He has called me to follow him. And I have never regretted following him. It has led me and allowed me to be a part of people's lives in a significant way. And I had no idea really why he chose me to be a pastor until COVID came along. And during COVID, because as many people know, very few doctors wanted to see COVID patients. Very few ERs wanted to see COVID patients. And people would come to the ER and they said, well, come back when you can't breathe. And they go, well, that's why I came.
Yeah.
And so during this time, my wife was still doing anesthesia, but I had started a free medical clinic out of our church in 2017. And I treated a lot of homeless skin infections. I helped people here and there, but it was pretty basic medicine. And but I'm used to people who are having low saturations and aren't breathing well, and this is typical ICU care. And so then suddenly I find myself, my free medical clinic is now quite busy. And so during the time of COVID, especially when Delta came through, sort of that, June, July of 2021, I saw over 700 people, and most of that was in their homes. So I would do house visits. I had people on home oxygen. I was giving them high dose steroids. I was doing whatever I could because I usually caught them late when their lungs were pretty bad shape. And at that point, a lot of people didn't want to go to the hospitals because they would be separated from their loved ones. And so they would just say, I'm not going to the hospital.
Yeah. And these were COVID positive people.
COVID positive people who had, and they're sick and they're older people. I'm a pediatric cardiologist, for heaven's sakes. Oh my gosh. I'm treating, but, how do I treat inflamed lungs? Well, I treat inflamed lungs basically the same way as I treat them with high dose steroids. And used a lot of steroids. Vitamin D was very important for your immune system. I had underappreciated that before until then. So zinc is very important for respiratory viruses. So I was using a lot of steroids, vitamin D, zinc, and then a whole bunch of other things, whatever I could to try to help these people. But most of it was, what I said at the end of the day is I think most of the time what helped is that I would hug them and I would pray for them. Because they felt like lepers.
Yeah.
And remember that time when if you got COVID, you felt you had done something wrong?
Yeah, I do.
And you were very ostracized. You were somehow, it was almost like you had to call out leper, unclean, unclean.
Yeah.
And so people within their own families were felt that way. And so then I sort of look back and go, wow, God, you really do know what's better for my life than I do, because I was able to be there for quite a few people and get them through that. So
I'm kind of speechless here. All of the things and how you have been led in a very amazing way by God. I mean, I can't imagine that you have written the script on your own. Because it's too crazy. It's almost unbelievable. I'm kind of going, is this really all real?
In 2000,
I know it is, but I mean, I'm listening to all of your experiences, and it's really, you've had like 10 lives.
In 2002, I legitimately prayed to God that prayer. out from Isaiah in Isaiah 6:8, where he said, "Here I am, send me."
Yeah. Well,
and I really meant it. And from then on, it's just been like,
yep.
So I tell people since 2009, I've flown 3 million miles.
It's amazing. Well, it's a dangerous prayer, especially when you're praying it to the God of the universe, because you never know where you're going to end up. And
But what a privilege it is to follow.
Yeah.
To follow him.
You know, I have to say, you're an incredible inspiration to me. I really mean that. I just listening to all this, it really does kind of, you're pushing it to a whole different level. And thank you for that. Well, I'm watching our time, Pastor Kirk, Dr. Kirk Milhoan, and our time is finishing here. And I want you to get back to your patients there. But
I have a few more minutes if you.
You have a few more minutes. Okay. So I do want to. So there's one last little thing I want to talk to you about, and that's COVID. You took COVID, and you know, here you are. You're a pediatric cardiovascular pharmacologist. You have a PhD in cardiovascular pharmacology and physiology, and you did not get the COVID shot. And I find that to be an interesting, and you're willing to, you put yourself in harm's way by going and actually spending time, apparently without much fear of yourself getting COVID. But you treated it, and you're very courageous. You kept your congregation going too during that time when a lot of other congregations were closed. But tell us a little bit about why you did not get the COVID vaccine.
Sure. So, when it came out, when it was in like December of 2019, it's just like, okay, we've been through this before with China. I was in Beijing during SARS-1 when everybody was masked in the Beijing airport, and I wasn't masked because we know that these particles are so small that a mask doesn't stop them, especially the kinds that everybody was wearing. I was in the Middle East when MERS came out. I was in when a whole bunch of people came back from the Hajj and had a sort of the Middle Eastern variety of the acute respiratory viral syndrome. And so I thought, okay, this is going to be no big deal. But then the report started getting in, and it was a little bit more concerning. But we didn't know how many people who had got it, maybe who didn't die. All we were hearing is about all these people who died. So my wife and I spent a lot of time talking about it. And I remember as it started getting more intense around March of 2020, I was on my knees in front of by myself at our church. And I asked God, what would you have me do? Because we had a pantry that has been running basically since I was there, since I started. And so we've helped a lot of people. We're set up to help people who are in need. And when they shut down Maui, everybody had need because a lot of the people who are the working poor, their jobs went away and they didn't get any money. And so our pantry now we went to 7 days a week, and we had thousands of people coming to see us, thousands of people. And I said, Lord, what do you want me to do? Because remember that time, if you got COVID, everyone thought they were going to die. And then you were also blamed, like, you're a spreader, you're a super spreader, So I said, Lord, what do you want me to do? And he said, keep the doors open. So we did. And we were very careful as much as we could, figuring out what was needed, what was in. We were very good at sanitizing. We were doing everything we could.
Sure.
That makes sense for respiratory viruses. And at the end of it, sort of in May, when things sort of settled down a little bit, I did a study where I looked at the antibodies of everybody who was in our pantry. So I did a study and looked at how many people had converted and had been infected with COVID, because we take care of a lot of the homeless.
Yeah.
There was a study out of Boston that showed 43% of the homeless were positive for COVID. So I wanted to see how we were doing taking care of it. And so out of 120 people, we had about 6 people who were positive for antibodies.
These are you're talking about the volunteers who work in the food pantry, handing out food to the people who are coming. Okay, gotcha.
And we were doing everything we can, but but
Yeah.
these were people who were hurting. I remember there was one time this little older Filipino woman came in, and she had been in her house by herself for months because nobody would come. Everybody was afraid. And she came, and we were saying, well, the county's really mad if we touch you. They want everybody to be 6 feet apart. But one of our volunteers said, would you like a hug? And so she goes, yes. And so one of our volunteers hugged her, and they watched the clock. She did not let go for 10 minutes.
Wow.
She just wept.
Hmm.
And that was sort of what I was seeing when I eventually started treating people. But I realized that not that many people it wasn't, especially legacy, the first one wasn't as transmittable as everyone was afraid. And kids weren't getting really sick. And it wasn't necessarily a death sentence because my wife turned positive and we didn't know when she had it. Okay. And I didn't get it.
Yeah.
And we had three couples. We had three couples that only one of them were positive antibodies.
Yeah.
So,
I think that the crazy thing is that COVID was very tricky. It was, you couldn't make heads or tails of it.
And what a little bit of time we realized, the elderly, the diabetics, the obese, and you know what? The bodybuilders, especially those who were on the juice, they were really sick with COVID. So we sort of went through that. And then when they started talking about a vaccine, and I've gotten every vaccine. I was in the military. I'm a pediatrician. I'm not an anti-vax person, but I'm also like, we got to look at the benefits, the risks, how much it's needed for anything, right?
Yes.
For anything. Yeah. I can kill you with Bactrim and give you Stevens-Johnson syndrome. I can put you into anaphylaxis with penicillin. Everything has they have benefits and risks. So when they started talking about the vaccine, and I started hearing about, and I knew what was happening with COVID, I thought, you know what? This is a vasculitis, and it's activating a certain pathway that I remember from my PhD days. And so now what we know is that the exact pathway that I studied to what causes heart inflammation is the exact pathway that the spike protein initiates to cause myocarditis, and anything like that. So when I started looking at how the vaccine was made, it utilized a spike protein, which is the surface nodule. And I thought, well, I already have had COVID. I have antibodies to prove it. I had T-cell evaluations to prove that I was immune. And when I got Delta, my wife, who had legacy, didn't get sick.
Wow.
So then I have to ask myself, okay, this is a new platform, a new vaccine. Do I get any benefit from it above my natural immunity? And I think when we were talking to people, you realize natural immunity was pretty good. Yeah. Now we know because of the Cleveland Clinic study that natural immunity is better than vaccine immunity. That's just what the data shows. 52,000 workers at Cleveland Clinic, the natural immunity was better than the vaccine immunity. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But you know what? It doesn't. Everyone tries to do the best they can. I have nothing negative to say about people. I'm not one of those. I don't want to say bad things about people who are unvaccinated. I don't want to say bad things about people who are vaccinated. Right? There are lots of different reasons why people made the choices they made. As a physician, what am I supposed to do? If there's someone sick in front of me, I help them.
You take care of them.
If they have COVID, I help them. If they have something else, I help them. If they have an injury, if they have long COVID, I'm still helping people with that. If they have a vaccine injury, I try to help them the best I can. Right? We got into this really very sad place as a society where we made each other enemies, as opposed to coming together and saying, how do we fight this together?
Yeah. And
there's a lot of finger pointing, and there still is a lot of finger pointing. And it really fractionated our country. It destroyed our kids. It really destroyed our kids. What we did to our kids with the lockdowns. I was a big fan of the Great Barrington Declaration because I think it made sense.
Yeah, I remember that. No, listen.
Koldorf and Bhattacharya, those guys are world-renowned biostatisticians. I thought that what they came up with was very realistic, but we didn't. For whatever reason, the world didn't go like that. And so what do we do now?
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
How do we help people walk through this? And then I hope when the next thing comes, because there's always a next thing, when the next thing comes, is I hope that we don't make each other our enemies.
yeah,
I mean, this is the call of Christ. How do we love one another? And I don't believe that's by doing this or not doing that. I think that the bottom line is we love our neighbor as ourselves. I love my neighbor whether he's unvaccinated or vaccinated.
right.
I love my neighbor whether I agree I'm going to vote for the same candidate or not.
Right.
It's because it's the high call of Christ. So, but I think we need a lot of that healing because it became so contentious. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of families that are still broken up
Because no, let me tell you, we could do an entire show on this. It has been a major polarizing event in the country, and my hope is that we begin to heal and we begin to both sides of this fracas say, okay, let's lay down the weapons. Okay, well, listen, I am watching the time. Kirk, you have been an amazing guest. I have to tell you, I'm humbled before your work and what you have done, and your heart is so huge. And may God continue to bless you in both your work in pediatric cardiology there in Africa and Tanzania, and also in your work there in South Maui. So you're a remarkable guy, and thank you for taking this time to be with us. And I hope our paths cross many, many times in the future. Okay, so friends.
Anytime.
Thank you. So, friends, thank you for listening today, for tuning into the Hamilton Review. We've had an amazingly interesting conversation, unexpected, actually, Dr. Milhoan, all you've done with Dr. Kirk Milhoan. He is a pediatric cardiologist, and if you go to South Maui, you can check him out. He is at Calvary Chapel, ministering God's Word over there. So he's a remarkable guy. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Dr. Milhoan.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Bob.
You're welcome. And friends, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.